Coming to paperback and e-readers, Isis Dark Incubus. The goddess next door gets enthralled in a romantic entanglement with an evil incubus in this all-new Isis series adventure. Pre-order your copy of Isis Dark Incubus at Amazon.com and other online booksellers everywhere. Historical couples in crisis. One of my viewers wanted me to do another installment in the Historical Couples in Crisis series. And for this installment in the Historical Couples in Crisis series, I'm going to be talking about late Playboy Playmate of the Year Dorothy Stratten and her husband Paul Snider. Now, the first person in this historical couple in crisis I'm going to be talking about is Dorothy Stratten. Now, Dorothy Stratten was a model for the adult magazine Playboy, and she went on to become the Playmate of the Year for 1980 before she started to go on to start a career in acting in Hollywood. And sadly, just as Dorothy Stratten was starting to build momentum into mainstream Hollywood, her life was cut short by her estranged husband, Paul Snider, who sexually violated her before murdering her and wound up committing suicide to avoid being held accountable by the criminal justice system. Now, Dorothy Stratten wound up becoming on the road to becoming a woman in crisis way before she met Paul Snider, and she was on the road to becoming a woman in crisis in the household she was raised in. Now, Dorothy Stratten was in a household where her family had roots from the Netherlands because her original name was Dorothy Hoog Stratten, and her father, Simon Hoog Stratten, wound up leaving the family when she was 3 years old. And Dorothy Stratten was raised by a single mother who was on welfare as she was training to become a nurse, and her mother basically raised her along with her brother and her half-sister from another relationship, and Dorothy Stratten basically was on the road to becoming a woman in crisis because she never had a father in her life to nurture her and give her emotional security, and this is what led to Dorothy Stratten becoming a very shy girl, and this shy girl basically grew up looking to try to help out her family, and that's what led to her getting work at a Dairy Queen where she worked to try to help her family make ends meet. And as she was looking to try to help her family make ends meet, she eventually ran into Paul Snider at that Dairy Queen. Now, Paul Snider was 9 years older than Dorothy Stratten. He was 26, and she was if she's 9, she's about 15 or 16. And that's where she ran into Paul Snider, who proclaimed himself to be some sort of pimp or car promoter, but he didn't have much success in that business. And when he saw Dorothy Stratten, he thought he could go out here and use her as an attachment to springboard himself to some sort of success. Now, Paul Snider was one of these guys who was one of these beta males who really didn't know how to make life work, and he thought he could go out here and tether himself to Dorothy Stratten using this attractive woman as a way to get into other social circles, and that's basically what he was trying to do when he decided that when he heard about the Playboy 25th anniversary model search, he went out here, and after being in a relationship with Dorothy Stratten, where he went out here and bought her expensive clothes and drove her around in nice cars and allowed her to be able to have a guy to brag about. What he did was go out and look to try to persuade Dorothy Stratten to go from posing in pictures in her prom dress to going to try to pose nude in photos. Now, he went out here and took this woman who possibly could have been underage and had her take nude photos with a professional photographer, and then sent those pictures over to Hugh Hefner at Playboy. And after Hugh Hefner got those pictures at Playboy, what happened was she was invited to come to the United States to try to become the 25th anniversary Playmate. Now, Dorothy Stratten fell very short as related to that whole contest, but was featured in a Playboy magazine as a 1979 Playmate. And as she was featured in a magazine as a 1979 Playmate, she eventually became so popular that she wound up on the road to becoming someone that people wanted to talk about. And Hugh Hefner saw a potential in her. And as Hugh Hefner saw potential in her, he decided to make her one of his bunnies. And as he had her as one of his bunnies in his clubs, this basically led to Dorothy Stratten being in a place where she was around a group of higher status men than Paul Snider, and in a higher social circle than Paul Snider. And with Dorothy Stratten being a young woman coming from poverty, basically her natural hypergamy was kicking in, and with her seeing that she could be in a social circle with higher status men and men with greater resources, she started to look to work with those men and started to put distance between herself and Paul Snider. And as Dorothy Stratten was looking to put distance between herself and Paul Snider, what she was doing was working in Playboy clubs and then started working in direct-to-video projects or film projects that Hugh Hefner was putting together. One was about roller skating, which was a big thing in the late 70s and early 80s, and another was another Playboy video. This was the start of Hugh Hefner's direct-to-video, and around that time, this is where people started to see Dorothy Stratten's natural acting ability, and as they saw Dorothy Stratten's natural acting ability, this is where she started to get the attention of director Peter Bogdanovich. Now, Peter Bogdanovich was an acclaimed filmmaker, and he was looking to put together a film, and as he was looking to put together this film, he then went out here and cast Dorothy Stratten in his movie. And as he cast her in this movie, after seeing her in two of Hugh Hefner's films, the Playboy Roller Disco and the Playboy Pajama Party, that's when he decided to start to wanted to cast her in this movie, and wanted to cast her in this movie because Hugh Hefner also was looking to try to make it where his Playboy playmates could start entering into legitimate films, because before then the only projects that playmates usually starred in were these just direct-to-video Playboy Playmate videos like the Pajama Party and the Roller Disco. Those were the only types of films that people could usually wind up playmates could come in, because Hollywood didn't want any association with Playboy Playmates. But you had Bogdanovich, who saw potential in Dorothy Stratten, and as he saw potential in Dorothy Stratten, she started to get not only that whole Peter Bogdanovich checking her out, she was starting to get legitimate appearances in movies and TV shows, and that was really upsetting Paul Snider, who was hoping to use Dorothy Stratten to be his meal ticket. Unfortunately, as Dorothy Stratten had entered into this social circle, he found himself slowly being cut out of that social circle, first by Hugh Hefner, who basically cut him out of the Playboy Club and the Playboy enterprises, because they saw him as a liability due to his insecurity and the fact that he would just constantly be calling the Playboy Mansion. They saw him as a liability, and they also saw him as a liability because he was just somebody who just really didn't understand how the entertainment business worked, and because they saw him as a liability, they basically were looking to cut him out of the whole business of Hollywood. Now, this basically wound up upsetting Paul Snider, because Paul Snider wanted to try to use Dorothy Stratten to be his meal ticket, because as a so-called pimp, He wanted to be the one who would make the money off Dorothy Stratten, but there was no way for him to make any money because he had basically been cut out by bigger hustlers and more seasoned hustlers in Hugh Hefner and Peter Bogdanovich. And the whole thing is that Paul Snider just didn't know how to run game like they did in Hollywood. No, the game he ran in Canada wasn't the same game they ran in America. And the game that he thought he could run in Hollywood, he thought he could go out here and think that he could run that game. But sadly, that game wasn't running, and his meal ticket wound up being taken away by these more seasoned hustlers. And those seasoned hustlers basically, this was a major bruise to Paul Snider's ego. And as Dorothy Stratton's star started to rise, and she was going from making appearances on TV shows like Buck Rogers, I believe, and other TV shows, this had Paul Snider seething with anger as his wife was starting to rise to stardom. And as she rose to stardom, this is what got him upset, because he couldn't get that fame for himself. And what made him even more upset was that Dorothy started to see her own potential for herself, as Hugh Hefner and people like Peter Bogdanovich were telling her how great she was. And as she started to actualize her potential, she started to see that she didn't really need this guy Paul Snider anymore. And this is where she started to cut ties with him and started to even do things like cut him out of having their joint bank account. And this is where Dorothy Stratten started to participate in her hypergamy even more, as she started to get the attention of director Peter Bogdanovich. Now, as she was working with Peter Bogdanovich on this film, what she did was start a relationship with Peter Bogdanovich. And as she started this affair with Peter Bogdanovich, she went from staying in her hotel room as they were filming the movie in New York to going to his hotel suite. And this really upset Paul Snider as she moved in with Peter Bogdanovich. And then eventually, as she returned to Los Angeles, she then rented out a dummy apartment and then began living at Peter Bogdanovich's mansion. Now, Paul Snider, not understanding that he had basically lost to hypergamy, was seething in anger, and he was seethed in anger because he was upset that Dorothy Stratten had just finally moved on, and because he was a beta male, he could not charge her to the game because he was upset about losing what we believed to be his property. And because he felt like he had lost his property, what he thought he would do is destroy that property to prevent another man of higher status from being able to have that property. That's why Paul Snider went out and exploded in a rage, because he saw Dorothy Stratten not as a person, but as an object. And tragically, this is what led to Dorothy Stratten sadly winding up on a road to losing her life, because as she was looking to try to divorce Paul Snider and move on with her career, what happened was we had Paul Snider seething in anger, and as he seethed in anger about losing out on his whole ability to make a living, he wanted to go out here and destroy her life to prevent her from having success. Success he thought that he got her. So this is where Paul Snider went out and bought a 12-gauge shotgun and took that shotgun, and as he was meeting to deal with Dorothy Stratten as related to the divorce and separating from him, he decided to sexually violate her and then shot her in the face with that shotgun, an expression of his contempt. He then, after shooting her and then doing things to her body, he then went and participated in committing suicide, showing us all how sick and depraved Paul Snider truly was, because for Paul Snider, he never really loved Dorothy Stratten. No, All he loved was the power he had over Dorothy Stratten, and he loved the fantasy he had about having success, but he never had that courage to go out here and get that success for himself. And that's what's really sad about the story of Dorothy Stratten. Sadly, Dorothy Stratten never got love from a man. No, she never got loved from a man. She sadly was being used by and exploited by everyone. I'd say that she was being exploited by Paul Snider first because there was no father there to protect her, and she was then further exploited after Paul Snider then took her into the world of adult entertainment with Playboy by Hugh Hefner, and as he was exploited by Hugh Hefner and made into the Playmate of the Year, she then was taken further down the road where she was exploited by Hollywood by Peter Bogdanovich, who basically didn't really love Dorothy Stratten. He loved the fantasy of this beautiful blonde being on his arm, and that was shown with his very disturbing behavior because Peter Bogdanovich, before he met Dorothy Stratten, was a focused director who made quality films. However, after he got involved with Dorothy Stratten, he wound up himself on the road to becoming a man in crisis because he was so traumatized by the death of Dorothy Stratten and possibly his guilt regarding it that he basically got involved with Dorothy Stratten's younger sister. And as he got involved with the younger sister, some say that he got into a relationship with the younger sister, which shows me that he really didn't love the sister. He loved her because she was adjacent to Dorothy Stratten, and I believe was projecting Dorothy onto the sister. And eventually, this 40-something man got involved with the younger sister and married the sister. And it just shows me that Dorothy Stratten wasn't a person to anyone. And sadly, she wasn't a person to anyone, including her father. And that's basically what led to Dorothy Stratten going from being a woman who wanted to have dreams of being a secretary to sadly winding up becoming a woman in crisis. Now, the second person I'm going to be talking about in this historical couple in crisis is Dorothy Stratten's estranged husband, Paul Snider. Now, Paul Snider was the man who hoped to use Dorothy Stratten's beauty as a ticket to his own financial success. And sadly, what happened was his insecurities about Dorothy Stratten getting more attention without him led to him making the plans to murder her in 1980. Now, Paul Snider basically was on the road to becoming a man in crisis even before he ever met Dorothy Stratten. And as he was young, he was raised in a very dysfunctional household. And as he was raised in that dysfunctional household, he wound up possibly with his mother leaving the family or passing away, depending on reports. And as a result, he dropped out of school in the 7th grade and allegedly went to work at his father's sweatshop. And as he worked at his father's sweatshop, this is where I believe he entered a place called the secret world that many beta males love to go. Now, whenever a beta male is feeling inadequate about their lives in the real world, what they do is enter a rose-colored reality where they can feel secure about their natural masculinity and their natural sexuality. And I believe what happened with Paul Snider is that because his life was so rough, he began to create a rose-colored reality in a place called the secret world. And in that secret world, he imagined himself as a man who had power, and the man who he imagined himself as having power was a pimp. And as he became this pimp, he went out and had this fantasy of having power as this pimp and promoter, and went around with a gold Star of David medallion on his chest and wearing flashy clothes to make up this image of himself being some sort of self-proclaimed pimp and hustler, even though it was clear that his ability to hustle wasn't very good because he wasn't very successful at hustling, and he basically was looking to use people similar to the way Pookie uses people to get himself ahead. And this Pookie, basically what he wanted to do was have women doing work for him, because he supposedly had some prostitutes. And as those prostitutes worked for him and made him money, he would make himself appear to be a larger man than he actually was. Now, this whole game is what Paul Snider used when he went to the Dairy Queen to meet up with Dorothy Stratten. And Dorothy Stratten, being a young, naive, about, I believe, 15 or 16-year-old girl, she basically wound up buying into Paul Snider's flashy game of him being a so-called promoter and pimp, a guy who basically really didn't have much of anything, because he was a Canadian, he was in Canada, and he was not really that big of a hustler. No, he ran a game on Dorothy Stratten because she was young and naive, and because she was desperate. She basically believed that he was bigger than what he was, and with him being an older man, because he was 9 years older than Dorothy Stratten, she thought she could get social currency because this guy was 9 years older, and for women, older men are more attractive, but she really couldn't see what a loser he was, because she didn't have, one, a father to vet this Paul Snider, and two, she didn't have any sort of father to protect her from this kind of man or show an example of actual manhood. So Dorothy Stratten wound up falling for his games and his whole false image that he created in the secret world. And as she fell for his whole false image, she was persuaded to start thinking that she was involved with a guy of high status, when in actuality she was with a guy who was far beneath her. And this guy basically was looking to not go out here and have a relationship with her, but he was looking to possess her as an object that he could use as an attachment to get himself into higher social circles. And what Paul Snider was doing was participating in male hypergamy, looking to use Dorothy Stratten as an object. And this is something that beta males do, because beta males don't have healthy relationships. And I talk about this in The Man Crisis, about how beta males have relationships. Beta males, when they have relationships, they look to use women as attachments to get themselves into higher social circles. And when Paul Snider heard about the 25th anniversary Playmate search, he decided to go out here and exploit his girlfriend by having her first take pictures in a prom dress with a professional photographer, then persuading her to pose nude in some professional photos, and then submitted those photos to Playboy, which Hugh Hefner quickly saw. And after Hugh Hefner saw these pictures, he then invited them both to Los Angeles, and Paul Snider married Dorothy Stratten. Again, this was a girl who was about 18 years old, not because he loved Dorothy Stratten, but because he wanted to have power over Dorothy Stratten and have control over her as the spouse and as the head of household in this twisted relationship, be the one who would go out here and be able to leech off his girlfriend, because any man of character would not want his girlfriend to be out here in Playboy, because that would reflect negatively on him. But that didn't matter to Paul Snider, because for him, his wife was nothing but property, no different than a car or a pair of shoes, something that he could commodify and trade and be able to try to elevate his own social status. Now, this was the covert contract that Paul Snider had as related to his relationship with Dorothy Stratten. He had hoped to use his wife's sexy body as a way to be able to try to exchange it to gain higher social status for himself with men like Hugh Hefner. Unfortunately, what happened was, with those men like Hugh Hefner, they had their own plans for Dorothy Stratten, and because they had their own plans for Dorothy Stratten, they really had no use for Paul Snider, who they began to see as a bit of a nuisance. And because they saw him as a bit of a nuisance, they began to look to try to find a way to cut him out of the picture. And as Paul Snider began to see himself getting cut out of the picture and started to see that his covert contract was being voided by people who he thought were going to validate him, this is where Paul Snider's insecurities started to flare up, because he saw these people looking to take away his meal ticket. And as he saw people trying to take away his meal ticket, this is where he started to become very desperate. And as he started to become very desperate, he started to see that he was not going to be in those Hollywood circles like he thought he was. Now, Paul Snider tried to adapt, and as he tried to adapt, he didn't really understand that Hollywood is filled with predators, and those predators basically take advantage of anyone out here who is green. Now, Paul Snider, because he was upset about Hugh Hefner basically taking Dorothy Stratten to be a part of his Playboy enterprise, looked to start his own enterprise, not because he wanted to build a business, but to spite Hugh Hefner. And as he looked to spite Hugh Hefner, what Paul Snider did was start the Chippendale Dancers, who were supposed to be like male Playboy guys, and with their collars, bow ties, and cuffs. But he sadly got swerved out of that deal because the guy who he was business partners with, he basically wound up signing bad contracts. And as he signed those bad contracts, what happened to Paul Snider was he was fiscally cut out of a deal of that business plan. And as he got cut out of that business plan, this basically started him simmering and boiling in anger because he was already upset that he had already lost one meal ticket. And as he lost the Dorothy Stratten meal ticket, he lost another meal ticket in the Chippendales. And he then lost another deal where he had this torture rack he had planned to make. And that torture rack deal never got off the ground, but a prototype sat up in his house. And he was simmering and boiling in anger because he could not become the man he fantasized himself as. And as he started to deal with the real world, this is where Paul Snider started to see that he wasn't the success he thought he was. And he never really was a success because he basically was out here looking to leech off other people, never looking to build his own thing because he was living in a rose-colored reality. And because he was living in this rose-colored reality, he couldn't see that all of his so-called success was basically tethering on other people, leeching off their success. And that's what led to him turning in anger against his wife, who basically was participating in natural hypergamy, ironically due to him basically putting her on the road to Playboy. And as Dorothy Stratten was starting to rise as related to her star, this is where Paul Snider really got upset. And he got upset because his wife was starting to outshine him, and he was losing control over her as his property. And as he was losing control over her as his property, this is where Paul Snider started to go from simmering and boiling in anger to seething in rage because his wife, as she participated in natural hypergamy, once she started to get acting roles, going from Playboy to acting and starring in TV shows like Buck Rogers and starring a star in B movies like Galaxina and graduating to legitimate movies and a relationship with a legitimate director like Peter Bogdanovich, this is where Paul Snider started to explode in rage because he was losing control over his meal ticket and he was not going to be able to be a fiscal success. And as he saw himself not being this fiscal success, what happened to Paul Snider was, since he felt he could not have the success he imagined in the secret world, he sought to destroy Dorothy Stratten's life in the real world. And as he sought to destroy Dorothy Stratten's life in the real world, she was looking to divorce him and cut ties with him, persuaded by Hugh Hefner and Peter Bogdanovich. And as Peter Bogdanovich began to get involved with Dorothy Stratten, he began to look to move her away from Paul Snider, a beta male who basically had nothing at this point. And with him having absolutely nothing at this point, he felt like he had nothing to lose. And since he felt like he had nothing to lose, what Paul Snider did was he planned to take the life of his estranged wife, because he said if he could not have that success, she would not have it. And as they were looking to meet to try to deal with things, Dorothy Stratten made a major mistake in meeting with him alone, and that tragically led to the end of her life, because this is where Peter, what was his name, Paul Snider, then took a shotgun that he purchased from someone at a sale, and took this gun and then shot Dorothy Stratten in the face. Again, an expression of contempt, because he basically wanted to mar and disfigure this woman so nobody else could see her beauty anymore. And then this is after he sexually violated and sodomized this woman. Again, he wanted to break down and humiliate this woman. He wanted to take power in the worst way over this woman at that meeting, because he didn't want to settle the divorce. No, he wanted to destroy this woman. He wanted to destroy this woman. He wanted to break her spirit by sexually violating and sodomizing her first, before shooting her in the face, and then to make sure that none of these men could ever get him in the criminal justice system, where he would be confronted by the 1980s versions of Bubba, Tiny, Roscoe, Big Dave, Melvin, and Mr. Sprinkles. He decided to take his own life, to say that he had power to give life and power to take life, but really showing us all the beta male he really was. And this beta male basically didn't love this woman. No, he loved the power he had over her. He loved the control he had. And in a desperate attempt to get power and control over this woman, he sought to destroy her life, taking her away from the success that he thought he had given her. But it was his whole perception of self, as related to his low self-esteem, that basically put this woman on this road, because this man was living in, again, a rose-colored reality where he thought he had all this power as a pimp, but in actuality he was nothing more than a trick that basically was looking to use this woman to get himself ahead, because he was afraid to be the man he wanted to be. And that's the reason why he was in this rose-colored reality, talking about he was a pimp and a promoter, but he wasn't a promoter of anything. No, Dorothy Stratten could have sent those pictures in herself if she wanted to. She could have had anything that she wanted, but she wanted to be a secretary. But sadly, what happened to Dorothy Stratten is that because she got involved with this guy, Paul Snider, she went on the road to becoming one part of a couple in crisis. Now, if you want to learn more about what leads to men and women winding up on a dysfunctional road, you can pick up my books, The Man Crisis and The Woman Crisis, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find The Man Crisis and The Woman Crisis at other online booksellers like Draft to Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, and Target, and also on other online booksellers like the iBookstore and other stores like Smashwords. And if you want to see me make more videos about historical couples in crisis, you can send a donation of a minimum of $15 to the Cash App or the PayPal by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Coming to paperback and e-readers, Esteem Horror in the Hamptons. The aspiring angel tries to escape a house of horrors in this all-new Esteem series adventure. Pre-order your copy of Esteem Horror in the Hamptons in digital format at Amazon.com, Google Play, Draft to Digital, and other digital booksellers, or pick up your paperback copy on May 24th. Coming to paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, Illuminati. The man who rules the world takes on the head of the global elite in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Pre-order your copy of John Haynes Illuminati on Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Now available in paperback. From the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Man Crisis, comes The Woman Crisis. Learn why so many women have become lost in their quest to have it all in The Woman Crisis. Get your copy of The Woman Crisis in paperback at Amazon.com and online booksellers today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.